had more than 850 people registered for this webinar. I think that really shows the level of interest that everyone has in the new legislation tabled by the federal government to tackle online hate. I'm really looking forward to hearing a spirited debate and some differing points of views on what's fact and what's fiction in terms of this new online harms bill. My name is Gail Adelson-Markovitz, and I'm the national chair of the board for CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. It has become clear that our community has both interest and concern about this bill and what it means for Jews in Canada, not just because of the hundreds that have registered here today, but also because of the feedback that we've collected and the questions we've put to the panel of experts that have been assembled here today. The themes of these webinars, unity, not uniformity, is particularly appropriate for this topic because we've heard a range of different questions from within the Jewish community about the legislation. Unity, not uniformity means that we won't necessarily agree on everything or share the same opinions, but we do remain united. We should remain united, and when we have a better understanding of both sides of the debate, it will really help the dialogue and help us move forward. With that said, we're very fortunate to have an incredible panel here today, and moderating that panel is Richard Marceau. Richard is the General Counsel and Vice President of CIJA, and together with several of our professional staff has worked extremely hard on this file. Richard is also a former member of Parliament. He is a lawyer, a published author, a human rights activist, and a person who is passionate about the Jewish story. He understands both the pros and the cons of this legislation, and he brings in today two panelists that have been heavily involved in this legislation and present both sides of this debate. So Richard, I will let you take over from here, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be moderating this panel. As Gail said, we know there's a lot of questions and comments within our community. We will tackle them head on. Couple of things that I want to flag at the beginning in order to be fully transparent. Given the level of anti-Semitism online, something that affects all of us, but especially our children who spend so much time online, CIJA has long been advocating that something had to be done to combat online hate. And the level of anti-Semitism, both online and offline now, are at an all-time high. And the numbers of emails and calls that we get daily to ask for help about anti-Semitism is off the charts. So not to mince words, there is a crisis of anti-Semitism in this country. So today, our aim is to cut through the noise, so to speak, and to give you upfront answers about the online harms bill, what it does and what it does not do. And in order to do this, we have two great panelists. Michael Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, and is a member of the Center for Law, Technology and Society. He has obtained a Bachelor of Laws from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, a Master's of Laws degrees from Cambridge University in the UK and Columbia Law School in New York, and he has a PhD from Columbia Law School. Dr. Geist serves on many boards, including the Internet Archive Canada and the Electronic Frontier Foundation Advisory Board. Bringing another perspective is Dr. Emily Laidlaw. Emily is a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law and Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. She's a Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance, Innovation, and Network Director of the Canadian Network on Information and Security. Emily researches in the areas of technology regulation and human rights, with focuses on platform regulation, online harms, privacy, freedom of expression, and corporate governance. She actively contributes to law reform and advisory work with recent projects on online harms, mis- and disinformation, defamation law, and intimate image abuse. She co-chaired the expert group that advised the federal government on development of the online harms bill. So thank you both for being here. As for the format, I will ask each of our panelists to give us their own overview of the bill for about 5 to 7 minutes. Then I will put questions to the panelists. Most of the questions actually come from you. Either what you wrote us, you commented on social media, Sometimes it was due to interactions. I know that at Kiddush, at Shul, after services, oftentimes I've been approached to talk about this bill. But just know that there's also a possibility for you to answer questions as we go through the process. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. Feel free to write questions that you would like me to pose the panelists. And I will do my best to get to all of them. It's a vast subject. We have an hour, but we will do our best. So to start with, I will pass the baton to Michael to give us an overview of the bill and where you stand on it. Michael.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Richard, and thank you to CJ for the invitation to participate. I actually think Emily and I have far more similarities than differences, I think, on this bill. So I think this will be an opportunity to really try to educate about what the Online Harms Act, or Bill C-63, does. I thought it's good to start to make sure that everybody's operating with the same baseline of knowledge. And the breakdown of this bill would start by recognizing that this is the result of several years of work. You mentioned that the community, and many communities, have been looking for this. Back in 2021, the government was about to introduce legislation. It held off after there was controversy associated with some other internet-related bills. It launched a consultation that summer. It was the same time as that 2021 election. And when many groups, many of the groups actually, and experts, and many of the groups that, quite frankly, were expected to support this legislation, criticized what the government had in mind, they decided to go back to the drawing board. And that included creating a new expert panel that Emily was co-chair of. There were additional consultations and roundtables. And I think, to the government's credit, on much of this bill, they took that expert advice seriously. And so we have now Bill C-63, or this Online Harms Act. I think it's best understood as at least two bills in one. There is an online harms piece that is involved regulating large internet platforms, what their responsibilities and potential liabilities might be for things that take place on their platforms. And then there is, in a sense, almost a second bill that includes changes to both the Criminal Code and the Canada Human Rights Act that is focused on hate, and more particularly on individuals, not on the platforms. The online harms piece, the platform piece, is really the main part of the legislation. It focuses on social media services, and it targets 7 harms in particular: sexually victimizing children, bullying, inducing a child to harm themselves, extremism or terrorism, inciting violence, fomenting hatred, and intimate content that is sent without consent, often referred to as revenge porn. Those are the harms. There are also, for these platforms that are really subject to this, subject to 3 duties. There's a duty to act responsibly that I'll come to in just a moment. There's a duty to protect children, which is largely focused on how they design their platforms to better protect kids. And there is a requirement to make certain content inaccessible, essentially to block content, really only 2 kinds of content, revenge porn and child endangerment. The duty to act responsibly for these platforms is really the core element of this legislation with platforms. It would include things like ensuring that you've got the ability for users to flag content that may violate the law, the ability to block other users. So if you're on a social media site and you're being harassed, you have the ability to block them, and a requirement to create a digital safety plan where you identify how you're going to deal with this, be far more transparent about how you deal with these kinds of harms. All of this is overseen by a new digital safety commissioner, and there's also the creation of an ombuds person that will assist, and Emily may get into that. Excuse me. Now, the second part of the bill involves several changes to the criminal code, including the prospect of a new offense where another offense is motivated by hatred, and that carries penalties that could go as high as life in prison. It's been pretty controversial, and I'm sure we'll come to it. There's also a new provision involving genocide or promoting genocide, which also carries life in prison, and the creation of a new peace bond, essentially a prior restraint, the ability to have some prior restraint in and around some of these issues. There is also, within the Canada Human Rights Act, the return of Section 13 that many here may be familiar with. It was quite controversial. It was in the law, then it was removed. It's back again, and it creates a provision dealing with the communication of hate speech and the prospect of complaints to the Human Rights Commission, and then potentially later to the tribunal, which would create actual real liability to the victim and potentially to the government as well. So that's the core of the legislation very quickly. quickly, if I might, just for a couple of minutes, provide you with a quick assessment of sort of the good and the bad. On the good side, I think there were many that breathed a sigh of relief that what the government had initially in mind, much of that was tossed to the side, and instead really did listen to the experts, particularly around the issue of online harms. And I think some of the approaches that they've taken really are quite sensible. We can debate some of around the edges, but it's a pretty good starting point. Where there are concerns, I think that, frankly, the duty to act responsibly is a little bit both a feature and a bug. We know the broad brushstrokes of what that might include for a platform, but there's a lot of uncertainty still. So it's easy to like it when we don't know the specifics. Perhaps when we get to the specifics, there may be some concerns. I think the oversight mechanisms definitely are a cause for some concern. There is this new digital safety commissioner. I believe there's a lack of oversight, a real lack of specifics, especially with what are truly quite enormous powers that are vested in the digital safety commissioner. And I believe trust in this legislation is going to depend in large measure and trust in how it's enforced with the digital safety commissioner. The other major concern, quite frankly, has been the criminal code provisions. I think the notion of life in prison, where any violation is motivated by hatred, the idea that could include life has some pretty significant implications, and I find it really difficult to justify. So that's some of my perspectives in a nutshell, but I know we'll have the chance to expand on this and many other issues during the Q&A.
Thank you, Michael. That's a great way, I think, to set the table and by having this overview of the bill. Emily, if you could share your perspective for a few minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Michael, for the great overview. And I think that we do have many shared concerns, and I'm sure that I think we should just sit down and solve the tweaks that need to be made to this legislation. So I thought I'd complement this too by talking about how this would work from a victim-centered perspective. So let's say, something, awful is happening online, and we'll, deal with the real world anti-Semitism that we've been seeing flowing online. What is available to an individual? Now, when Michael set out how there's three different, there's almost 2 or 3 different bills within one, there's good and bad about that we can debate. From a victim perspective, when something bad happens, you could say, well, what are the responsibilities of the social media company? And that would be the Online Harms Act that they're looking to create with the Digital Safety Commission. Or has a crime been committed and you want to go to law enforcement? Or are you looking at something else where that isn't at the level of criminal enforcement, but some sort of accountability for the individual, which is when you can make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. But for hate speech or advocating genocide, if the goal is to impose responsibility on social media services, to put into place some sort of mechanisms to mitigate risk, an individual can go and make a submission to this new Digital Safety Commission. There is no, the commission doesn't then investigate that. It's not a complaint to the commission. Basically, it receives that information, and then it becomes part of the information that it might share publicly about social media, or it might be the basis then that the Digital Safety Commission might launch a hearing, essentially like an investigation, but different, where it's investigating not your individual piece of content, but more broadly, say, if a social media service is complying with, what Michael talked about, is that duty to act responsibly. And that duty involves taking adequate measures to mitigate the risks of exposure to the harmful content, to exposure to, say, hate speech, to content that advocates genocide. The individual can go to this ombudsperson. I think this is really important. It is there to provide victim support, to say, look, this was happened, these are your options, this is how you can navigate it. The ombudsperson would be able to pass on information to that commission. Also, the Digital Safety Commission, a major part of their mandate is education and research supported by a digital safety office. So part of this is taking the data that they get from these companies and saying, okay, where do we go from here? What do we know about the landscape of what's going on? What are the next steps more broadly about supporting Canadians in addressing these types of harmful content? But for individuals, for their individual piece of content, in the end, when it comes to social media services, you're looking at still going directly to the social media service. But it's a long-term project with the Digital Safety Commission. It's about harm reduction, and it's about setting minimum standards for these companies about how they manage these risks of harm. And so hopefully, I mean, if this is working at harm reduction, the goal would be that you're going to see better standardization about how this is managed by social media services. Again, you can go to law enforcement. I have many concerns about the criminal code provisions, like Michael, that we can dig into. Or you can go to the Human Rights Commission. I think that reintroducing Section 13 was always going to be controversial. I think that some important steps have been taken to narrow the scope of it, a much clearer definition of hate, the ability to dismiss complaints, to be able to impose costs on parties that are frivolous and vexatious in the complaints that they make. I take seriously, though, Michael has commented separately on a panel with me about the concerns of weaponization of that process. And what I have been trying to mull are what are ways that, that can be contained, because there's an important access to justice element to being able to go to the Human Rights Commission. The last point I'll make is about the regulatory structure of the Digital Safety Commission. I don't have the concerns that Michael has about the structure of the commission itself. I think that there is oversight through the ordinary processes through the federal court. We need a commission that has the power to investigate, the power to impose fines. There is an important duty on the Digital Safety Commission to take account of privacy, freedom of expression, and equality, among other things, in setting out any of the guidelines it writes or any regulations. And much of this needs to be left to be developed later because of evolving tech and social media. Their powers are essentially to write regulations about risk management, digital safety, kids design, like what the obligations are to keep kids safe, and how to manage their complaints. So once I dug deeper, it doesn't seem as broad as it seems. It's very scoped to what it is, but certainly there is that uncertainty of saying we don't exactly know what the risk management plan will be for those particular companies. I think I'll leave it there, and we can dig into this with various questions and kind of we'll solve all of this, right, Michael?
Take our best shot.
Yeah, thank you. So quick question, just so to help me understand, like a very tactless, concrete thing. So I see something on Twitter that I think is very hateful. If this bill is in place, what do I do? What are the possibility, the options that as a Jewish person I can do? Can one of you answer that? Yes, Emily.
Maybe I'll just jump in, because that was a bit where I started, which is, well, the first step would be to complain to the social media platform. I think we're seeing, of course, on X that they're not taking very seriously any complaints about hate. The other option then is to submit that information to the Digital Safety Commission. They're not going to act on your complaint. That will be information that feeds whether they do a bigger investigation or bigger hearing about the social media service. Or you can go to the ombudsperson, who can't do anything exactly but provide support to help you figure out what to do. So that would be perhaps a first point of call as well, and they can help you navigate. And the last two options would be, if you think it's reached that threshold, go to the police or make a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, if I can for just a moment, Richard,
Please.
pick up on that. I think that provides a really good review of the different options. I will say that, the idea that this is suddenly going to result in, when you face something online, that it comes down or that you get justice is unlikely. It still will depend on, especially initially, some of the things social media companies do. I faced a lot of this sort of stuff, especially on Twitter, on my own account, when I post on anti-Semitism related concerns, and don't have really any expectation that the law would directly change that. But what it will change, and I think this is a positive, is that the process around dealing with some of this content where there are complaints about the prospect sometimes of content coming down is oftentimes very opaque. on a less controversial site, I had content that was removed when I posted an anti-Semitic image trying to highlight the fact that this is what the community is facing day in, day out right now in Canada in 2024. It's really unthinkable and quite astonishing. I posted it on LinkedIn. That content came down. It was presumably an algorithm or AI of some sort that decided that it came down because there wasn't the context. It went back up, it came back down again. Ultimately, there was some sort of review, but the entire process about how those decisions are made, something that we don't have much insight into. And what this legislation will do as part of a digital safety plan is not necessarily tell you what happened to your particular piece of content, but it will add, I think, far more transparency to a process that will require companies to disclose complaint data, information on how they respond to that data, and so that people may, in the individual case, be left unhappy or happy with what the resolution was, but at least we're going to have, I think, far better, more open information about what is actually taking place behind the curtain of many of these social media companies, which right now, very often you file a complaint and you have no real idea of what comes of it.
Okay, thank you. It's hard to have this conversation without taking the context into question. And we're seeing accusations that Israel is committing genocide, that if you're supporting Israel, you're supporting genocide. And there's concern out there that, and given also the context also that Jews are often portrayed as, at least by some people, as oppressors, both in Israel, because Israel is a powerhouse in the region, and in Canada, as being white, settler colonialists and all that stuff. And we've heard concerns that being a pro-Israel advocate, being a defender of Zionism, of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, could land somebody into legal trouble with this legislation. And I was getting emails just before this panel started. So I really like to have your thoughts on this, because we're hearing it, and your opinion matters on this. So Emily, if I could start with you and then go to Michael.
It's a really important question. And I would say that concern about what the threshold is for hatred is probably one of the key concerns about this legislation. So let me identify where I don't think there should be concern, and perhaps where there should be. The Supreme Court has set a very high threshold for what hate speech means. And none of what you're talking about would be captured by that. So hate speech is ultimately at that level where it's beyond even disdain, it's beyond offense, that you're essentially communicating statements that are predicated on the destruction of an entire group of people, and the threshold should be incredibly high. There's still a risk of a chilling effect because people are fearful of bad decisions by regulatory bodies, by companies, by law enforcement or Canadian Human Rights Commission about what that means, and being pulled into a process that they don't belong in, right? I would say that when it comes to the idea of the regulator, like the Digital Safety Commission, ultimately they have oversight of social media about broadly how they're dealing with these issues. So it doesn't really come up there, right? But what I would say is that there should be some sort of mandate about what the expertise is of those commissioners, in particular, very clear legal understanding about freedom of expression. I think that's key, and that's core to that body. When it comes to law enforcement, all they've done with the criminal code amendments has been to kind of embed in it the Supreme Court definition of hate. But I think that there's other problems with the criminal code provisions, which Michael and I can talk about. The Canadian Human Rights Commission, again, it's a high definition, but that's where I think the greater risk is. And I'm still I think that's where you're going to see that risk, right? And you're pulled into a process that you don't belong in because of different views of what hate means, at least what's meaningful to people. that's where I go to the question of, I want to find a way to tighten it, to make it better. I think, Michael, you might be landing saying the risks are too high and we should get rid of it. I'm curious what you have to
So
say.
I'll get to Michael, but I just want to push you on this a bit, Emily. So when you say that the risks are higher at the human rights in the human rights setting, is there anything like, does the bill include I guess boundaries or ways to avoid frivolous people being looped in or brought into frivolous litigation? And if there is, are they strong enough, or should we be asking for those bellies, for those protections to be higher? Please answer this, and then Michael, I'll have you add a few words, please.
Well, so there's strong protections and they might be sufficient. And it is that if it's evident that this isn't hate speech, then the commission can dismiss the complaint. If it's frivolous, they can impose costs. So it basically dissuades individuals from making a complaint that's specious, that's just made in bad faith. So there are things built into it. And they also narrow the definition of Section 13 compared to the old version. So it is Supreme Court Canada jurisprudence. So it might take care of things. What concerns me, which is what Michael, I will say, is the one who's mentioned this to me, is the fact that there can still be coordinated campaigns of well-funded groups that might target individuals. That needs to be solved somehow in the legislation. So I don't know if it is a fee. I don't know if it's some other metric to dismiss it. And I haven't solved that problem yet. I haven't figured out a way through that. It's what I'm wondering about.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, sure. I'll pick up on a few things that Emily said, and we do agree on most. I first want to actually emphasize that there is already a chilling effect for anyone in our community, and frankly, in a number of communities that speak out on these issues. There is a chilling effect. The backlash that you invariably face causes, I think, many people to think twice about whether they want to step out and comment. And it's not just online. There's a chilling effect offline as well. So these issues are very real, and and many of them will not be solved by legislation, no matter what the legislation says. The core elements in terms of dealing with the platforms don't address individuals at all. So the idea that an individual would be liable under the elements of the law that seek to create a duty to act responsibly for the platforms, it doesn't really affect individuals in that way. It's about what the platforms do. The platforms might themselves adopt certain policies, but and perhaps encouraged to do so through the legislation. But no one's landing in jail. I don't think anyone's landing in jail for these kind of comments, period. But they certainly aren't affected in that way based on the social media side of it. The criminal code provisions do, as Emily notes, raise concerns, but I don't think that the kind of speech that you're talking about and comes anywhere near the sort of level that would lead to any sort of prosecution. It is, as Emily suggests, at the Human Rights Commission that under the Human Rights Act that I think there are real risks. And I genuinely fear, based on what we see, that this will cause a weaponization of complaints that will flow in all directions. And this notion that there is the ability to dismiss complaints, which there is, and so those powers are, I think, important. But I think the prospect that an individual faces even one of these complaints, never mind potentially hundreds, where there are organized campaigns to target certain people that speak actively on a part of a community and claiming what they are doing is engaged in hate, I think must surely have even more than a chilling effect. I think it creates real fear in individuals. I mean, it is not a comfortable thing. I've never received one, but I'm quite certain it is not a comfortable thing to be advised that there has been a complaint filed against you at the Human Rights Commission based on something that you said on social media. And so looking at this as a mechanism to address this issue, I think carries some great risk. And if it had a realistic prospect of significantly altering what, Richard, you started off by talking about, a community genuinely in fear and deeply concerned about the level of anti-Semitism that's being faced. If there was, I think, a realistic chance that this process would have a positive effect in trying to address those issues, then one might be able to conclude that even that weaponization might still be worth the risk. But I frankly don't see a lot of evidence to suggest that when you think about what's taking place, that those that engage in that weaponization are going to be particularly persuaded to stop based on on almost anything. And so certainly not when those complaints might be dismissed, which unless you start raising penalties for those kinds of complaints. But otherwise, I think that we would continue to see the kind of hate regardless of the availability of this remedy. And there are real risks, I think, to individuals who might find themselves targeted as a result of it.
So if I can,
Yes,
is it
please.
okay if I jump in with one short? Because why I land differently on this is that I don't view it as reducing hate access to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I view it as access to justice. And at the moment, and if it remains unchanged, individuals, the only thing available to them is to go to law enforcement. Many groups don't feel comfortable with that. Law enforcement is overwhelmed. And yes, we need to take major steps to better resource, better train law enforcement to deal with this. But it's not always or necessarily the appropriate solution. Many provincial human rights bodies don't, even though they have hate speech provisions, won't hear them if they're related to the internet. They see that as federal. And so it means that except for going to the police, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing available for an individual who sees it as appropriate that they should access some sort of justice. And that's why I land that I don't have a solution to the weaponization yet. I just want to try to solve that one, because otherwise I do think that as reintroduced, it's important.
It is, if I can quickly, and we'll turn it into true debate. I think you're right about that. There isn't that remedy. But when you think of what that remedy involves, potentially years before, as this process works its way through the commission and then in through the tribunal, the risk that even the fact that you participated in that results in a further backlash as it continues. I'm not sure that that brings a whole lot of justice when, if presented with the alternative saying, are there mechanisms to try to stop the amplification of this hate, to try to support the community as a whole, even in the absence of myself being made potentially whole for the harm that occurred? I think many would say, listen, I really just want this to go away. And if there are mechanisms to reduce the amplification, to reduce the harm, that's where I want to put our resources and thinking, as opposed to saying that, well, I got mine in terms of some justice in a particular case.
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there. We could talk about this one forever.
I'm also mindful of the time, so I'd like to switch a little bit, because the internet is a global phenomena, and other countries or institutions that have started to grapple with this. The European Commission, the European Union has started, Australia has started. When you compare C63 with what other jurisdictions have done, how does it compare? Is Canada, were C63 adopted? Would it be an outlier? Would it be around in the same ballpark as what the European and the Australians, for example, have done? Maybe Emily and then Michael.
Yeah, so it has picked elements from the different regimes, and I think the best ones, it aligns with them, but it is narrower. So the Digital Safety Act in Europe covers a broader array of players. We aren't covering search engines. We're not covering private messaging. And the obligations are much broader, including all illegal content. They're even tackling disinformation, things that undermine democracy. None of that's in scope for ours. So ours is much more narrowly targeted. We have elements of the UK one. I think there's a bit more similarities, but even the UK one is much broader. So I think that we've landed in the right place, given, I think, the legal climate and where we balance freedom of expression with other rights, and also really the capacity of a regulator. If you're building something from scratch, there's only so much you can scope in. Australia started very narrow and built out. We aren't as narrow where Australia started. They were just for child safety, but that ship has sailed. I mean, there's no way we could have just started with child safety. But it's a good start.
Michael.
Yeah, I think Emily and I agree on this. It's worth noting, I mentioned off the top of my opening comments, that where the government started in this process when they consulted is a much different place from where we are now. And I think that at one time they were thinking about importing some provisions from other countries that were far more problematic. And I think thankfully, they've dispensed with that. The one part that I think that's worth emphasizing, that Emily's response, and frankly my response to this, will focus on the online harms piece. And so the emphasis will be, as a point of comparison, what are you doing with the platforms? What kind of responsibility and potential liability are you imposing on those platforms so that they step up to deal with these various harms? And in that respect, I think Canada has done a nice job of striking a balance and drawing from what they've seen elsewhere. The problem, come back to it, and it's inescapable when you start debating this legislation, is that that's not the whole bill. And when you get this second part of the bill, having thrown in the criminal code provisions and the Human Rights Act provisions, those are not the parts that we're drawing lessons from. And you don't, I know less about how those other jurisdictions deal with those issues, but where the government really did, I think, engage in that comparative analysis, especially with respect to, we recognize the power that the platforms have. That law as it exists right now alone is insufficient to deal with some of the concerns, especially around the algorithms, the amplification, the opacity in how these platforms deal with these issues. In that respect, we've, I think, done a good job and drawn some powerful lessons from what has occurred elsewhere.
Does the fact that most of the platforms are based outside of Canada play a role in what Canadian government or Canadian legislation can do?
Sure, I can kick off if you want. I think, of course, it does. I think that the legislation talks about mitigating these harms, doesn't talk about eliminating them. And I think there's a recognition that no legislation is going to entirely eliminate. But if you target the large players and potentially identify some other players along the way, that's enough of a starting point. It captures so many of the average users that at least you've had a positive effect in mitigating against some of the harms. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And so I think there's a recognition that there will be thresholds about which organizations or which entities this applies to. And I think that while some are skeptical about law on the internet, are these companies really going to apply with Canadian law? And I think there's every reason to believe that especially the larger players will. I mean, I think that they recognize they do have a responsibility. There will be a willingness, indeed a desire, to ensure that they are compliant with this legislation. They may push back on certain elements of it, but by and large, platforms aren't themselves happy to see the kind of harms that are taking place online. And if we impose these kinds of obligations, most will say, yeah, this is something that they're willing to comply with.
Thank you. Emily.
Yes, I think that enforcement has always been an issue. I mean, it's been that wicked issue with internet regulation since it was commercialized, but I don't think it's a reason not to pass laws. And we have in other contexts. I mean, privacy commissioners investigate companies that impact Canadians that are based elsewhere. And I think that where we fit in is that we're not the first player stepping onto the scene, because there are laws in the EU and the UK and Australia, and we're targeting the major global players. I agree with Michael that I don't think that they're going to have an issue. We're going to have an issue with them trying to shirk compliance in any way, because they're having to already comply with more onerous obligations in other jurisdictions.
Thank you. Obviously, at the heart of this conversation is the issue of free expression and free speech, and a lot of criticism are saying that it's an attempt to censor, to limit free speech, and one of the ways that I think the government is trying to land in a place that is legal, it's the use of the definition of hatred that flows from, and Emily, you were mentioning this, the Supreme Court Canada decision in Watcott back in 2013, if I remember correctly. At the time, the Supreme Court kind of landed at a place that said that the use of the Human Rights Code of Saskatchewan was, yes, a limit to free speech, but was reasonable in a free democratic society according to Section 1 of the Charter, broadly speaking. Do you think that where the bar is set in the bill in terms of what is hatred is high enough to, on the one hand, solidly protect freedom of expression, which is a fundamental values of Canada, and I would say that for Jews who have been minorities everywhere they've been, but for Israel, the right to be outside of the mainstream sometimes is very important, has been historically important. So on the one hand, that freedom of expression is protected, while at the same time catching the worst elements of hatred? Like, is the government setting the bar at the right level? And two, is the definition clear enough or tight enough that it will do what the government wants it to do? I will start with Michael and then Emily.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think the fact that they have relied on prior jurisprudence is another positive within the legislation. You know, I think that had they worked to establish an entirely new definition, and because this invariably does involve some very difficult line drawing, it would quite clearly be challenged on those grounds alone. And so the fact that they're relying on something that is somewhat tested, I think already makes quite a lot of sense. You know, is this going to have a chilling effect? You know, the question becomes, well, where does this apply? In a criminal code context, I must admit, I don't think that this inclusion, I already mentioned it, I don't think the inclusion of the additional penalties makes much sense. I don't think it has any real effect in terms of on the ground what the kind of hate that takes place. I think that this is primarily an enforcement issue. I wish law enforcement would enforce the laws as they stand now, and then we can see whether or not we've got shortcomings. But I think we've got more a failure of enforcement than we do a failure of the existing legislation when it comes to some of these languages, some of this legislation. Is there the potential for a chilling effect? I mean, the answer may well be I can't speak for every individual. I mean, there may be some that look at this and say, well, this might have an effect and I'm really concerned about it. I think for the vast majority of people, they don't really come close to this. It is a high bar. There are other safeguards and guardrails that are built into the system to seek to guard against it. And so, you know, I think many should be comforted by that. And I think that, and I alluded to it a moment ago, I think that we need to recognize that alongside the risk of a chilling effect from the legislation is the real world chilling effect that we have right now. So that when we have individuals who are afraid to speak because of the kind of hate that they themselves may face, that of course represents a significant issue and a limitation on their own freedom of expression. And we need to be conscious of that as we try to strike a balance with some of these issues.
Thank you. Emily.
Yes, and that's a good reminder that the issues of hate here are so far beyond, you know, what this legislation is tackling. I don't think that we can get more precise than the definition that has been provided. It is, as Michael said, set out in Supreme Court jurisprudence. There's criticism about the need to pinpoint something more precise, but you can't, because we need to be able to engage in a contextual analysis. Just 2 points. One is, so I wouldn't change the definition. What I would do for at least the Digital Safety Commission component, that Online Harms Act, I think that, you know, the private platforms play such a key role here in setting out in their own terms and conditions how they manage this. Their digital safety plan shouldn't just be how they mitigate risks of harm. I think they also need to set out how they are promoting and protecting freedom of expression, and also I would add privacy and equality. But I think that needs to be front in mind in how they manage their services. Right now, that provision is not in there. The only obligations on the commission, not the companies. When it comes to the criminal code provisions, I mean, it sets out to define hatred, fine. You know, it doesn't change anything, but it offers some clarity, perhaps. More concerning are the other dimensions of the criminal code provision, which I think that's where that chilling effect will happen. That standalone provision, risking, you know, life in prison. I think that I suppose you could tweak it slightly to make it a little bit better, not make it life in prison, not remove from it that it's violating any legislation, maybe just keep it to other criminal offenses, or you just scrap it entirely. That might be the easiest solution here.
So you mean hiving the criminal code amendments off of this legislation? Is that what you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Richard,
if I might, I just want to supplement on that, because I think both Emily and I are in agreement that it might have made sense to have excluded that. I have to say that I think there was a particularly compelling case to have stuck specifically with the online harms as its own piece of legislation. I think, frankly, the way that they've targeted it made a lot of sense, and frankly would have gone a long way to addressing some of these issues. And at a time when there has been enormous frustration at the lack of action by the federal government, by many governments, efforts in dealing with online hate, they could have, or dealing with hate more broadly, not just online, they could have packaged the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act provisions in a separate piece of legislation. I still would have problems with them, but at least it would not have sidetracked the good work that takes place, I think, with respect to the platforms. And frankly, the government would have had something that it could have pointed to say, okay, we are looking to try to deal with some of these issues. As it is, they run the risk, frankly, of bringing it all down and really bogging down and clouding the debate at a time when what we need, especially with some of the online harms related issues, is more clear-cut leadership and expeditious action.
I want to go back to something that both of you mentioned about the Digital Safety Commissioner. Two questions that I'm seeing in the chat. One is, how independent would that regulator be? Because there's this concern by some people that it would be at the direction of the government. So is the independence of that regulator protected or clear in the legislation? And if not, should it be clarified? And two, Michael, in your introduction, you were mentioning that commissioner might have too much power. I'd like to hear both of your insights on this. So I will start maybe with Emily, then I will go to Michael.
Yes, it's the body needs to be, the commission needs to be independent from government. I think it is inaccurate what I have read, that criticism saying that it would be government censorship. This isn't. This is set up as an independent body. The commissioners have terms of, I think, 5 years. I mean, I would say it's more comparable to the idea of that we have our privacy commissioner, and who I think is 7-year terms. Where there is some risk is the fact that in the end, government appoints the individuals. It needs to be approved. I think if I recall, it needs to be approved by Parliament. So it has a more bipartisan kind of nature to it, that the individuals in the commission would actually have to be approved by those bodies. So it should operate independently. And again, remember, its oversight is of companies, not of individuals. They're not making individual content decisions or holding individuals accountable here. So I think that when it comes to their power, if I can even jump ahead and guess, I know where some of Michael's concerns are, and I will say that this is an administrative body. It doesn't operate like a court. It has to follow. That means that the rules of evidence and how it proceeds is softer than a court. What it does have to follow is rules of procedural fairness. It has to be non-biased, it has to be open, has to basically have due process rules in how it operates, and ultimately, if there is an issue, can be taken to the federal court. So I'm okay with that process. I think where you can have debate is what should be detailed in the legislation versus later. The later parts, there's quite a bit of power to this commission, this body of 3 to 5 people, to write the regulations for the social media companies, to write out what they want in digital safety plans, to write out what they think kids' safety should look like. I think that's okay, because I think that is what's needed. There are guardrails saying this is what you have to have in, say, a digital safety plan. So I think it's landed appropriately, but I think that reasonable people might have different views about where that balance should be.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, all right. Hopefully, I'll be reasonable in saying that I do have some concerns, and I'll start just by noting first that we do need something to enforce this law. And I don't think we have a readily available option, so that it's not going to be the government. You don't want the government making decisions on content in this way. It's not going to be the CRTC, the Broadcast and Telecom Regulator, which I think is already out of its element in dealing with certain internet related issues. So we do need something. And I also want to emphasize that I think trust in this legislation really depends in great measure on this commission. That I think that, some of the concerns that you've been highlighting, Richard, I think they are very real. At the end of the day, much of the public confidence in this legislation is going to be dictated by this commission. And I think that there are from my own perspective, reasons for concerns. I mean, Emily's articulated, why this, its independence, and I agree with that. I don't see the independence issue as an issue. I have concerns about the size of the commission, quite frankly, when I think of just the wide range of kinds of issues that are going to come up in this context. You want people both that have expertise on issues like freedom of expression and privacy. You also want them to have an understanding of hate and harm and child endangerment and child-related issues. And how these platforms themselves function. You want some technical expertise. And then, of course, you want people who bring an independent view to all of this. I'm not convinced that the size of the commission, we have larger commissions, certainly with the CRTC, is the right size. But even more than that, the kind of power that it does have is remarkable in certain respects. It can issue rulings to make content inaccessible, conducts obviously investigations, it can demand any information it wants from these regulated services. It can hold hearings that, if it decides is appropriate under the circumstances, can be held in secret. The default is open, but it can say, no, in this instance, we want to hold it in secret. It will be establishing both regulations and codes of conduct, and this is very, very broad. The penalties are huge, potentially up to 6 to 8% of global revenues, and so it wields a lot of power. And then it does act, on its own with some amount of informality, and to me, this is a source of concern. So, for example, the legislation specifically states that Commission's not subject to any legal or technical rules of evidence, and it speaks to the need to act informally and expeditiously. And while I recognize that it is positioned to establish some of its own set of rules, with great power comes great responsibility. And at a minimum, it seems to me that it is incumbent on the government to flesh out in far more detail where the limits, where the guardrails are around the Commission, so that we aren't basically adopting a trust us approach with respect to the Commission as part of so many of the elements of how this legislation ultimately gets interpreted and plays out.
Thank you. Sorry, go
add
ahead.
a quick comment on that is okay, because I will say, it's really interesting point about the size of the commission, and I think that the list you gave, Michael, of the expertise is exactly the list of the kinds of expertise we need, so that supports the idea of a bigger commission. I would say that the idea of rules of technical evidence, that is actually in that is administrative law, isn't it? That is what the Privacy Commissioner, CRTC, all those regulators set up that way. And same when it comes to the inspection powers, that informality is kind of core to what administrative tribunals are. And I think that I wouldn't call them secret hearing. I would just say that they're closed hearings, and courts have closed hearings at times too. And there's some really special scenarios here if you're talking about child sexual abuse images and intimate images. I think it's fair to say, well, we want to know the circumstances around it, but that I suppose that is some of that trust element that you set out. But it is consistent too with what we see with what courts do, and that power to take down images is extraordinary. It is, but it is for two things. It's child sexual abuse material, and it is for intimate images. For me, I've always landed that you need a quick and easy remedy in that particular case. And if you were setting it out through a hearing or tribunal, just don't even bother. What you want is a commissioner with that power. That is consistent with what Australia is doing with their e-safety commissioner.
Thank you. I'd like to go briefly, because I'm looking at the time, mindful of the time. The issue of peace bond has drawn a lot of attention. So maybe one of you could explain what a peace bond is, but when I was speaking to the government, one of the examples they gave me is that, let's say John Doe is writing crazy anti-Semitic stuff on the internet, and one that raises a lot of question, and the fact that there could be a peace bond with all the process that peace bond that all the steps that need to be gone through before a peace bond is issued, that would be okay or reasonable to have, this John Doe should not be allowed within 100 meters of a synagogue or a Jewish community center and the like. So that's often the example that the government has given us. And I would like to hear your thought is the peace bond in those circumstances, does it make sense to use that tool that's already in existence in the context of online harm. Michael and then Emily.
Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, there's an online element. There may be an offline element, of course, there as well. I think this is a more defensible provision. I think there is still, going to be sources of concern, in part because this ventures peace bonds into an area that we traditionally wouldn't see them. So, the idea of peace bonds, which one might think of as prior restraint, is used in a range of different spaces, and oftentimes one can well understand why you would want to use it. If someone is fearful of assault in a domestic situation, you may want to ensure that you've got a restraint put in place to try to guard against the event actually happening, and that's what this is trying to do. You've got enough evidence to believe that this is likely to happen. You want to prevent it from happening rather than find yourself in a position where you now have to remedy after the fact, and the harm has been caused. Putting this in a speech context, though, is different, because it is certainly unusual to do it, and so I can well understand why there would be concerns associated with it. There are a significant amount of approvals and guardrails that are built into the process, and so I think it's something that I think we need to be working through with respect to the review that will ultimately take place before our committee to better understand, the precise uses and the guardrails that exist. I think as a concept, the idea of trying to prevent harm when we have a real notion, there is a real likelihood that it is going to occur, is certainly better than sort of after the fact trying to remedy or deal with the harm that takes place. And I further think that, and we've referenced it a few times, that in some ways the criminal code provisions have been tarnished by the inclusion of things like the life in prison, that it has muddied the debate around some of the other provisions as well. And that has made much of this discussion much more difficult.
Thank you. Emily.
I entirely agree with Michael. I think that this is where we can maybe clarify understanding is there. This is not a thought crime, a peace bond. It's this isn't Minority Report as it's been accused to be. But there is a legitimate discussion to be had about whether it should be used in the context of a speech crime. And I suppose you could say that it can be used right now for intimate images. So I guess you could call that, that's essentially communication and speech as well. But it is a de-escalation tool. So it's actually supposed to be a softer mechanism than the other. So there might be a legitimate use for it. But I am waiting to see, how this is discussed at committee and how they might ensure some constraint of it. But I do think that one, there might be a real potential value for that one to help address hate.
Thank you. Last question. So you are given full authority to legislate on online hate in Canada, and you have ultimate power to decide what to do with C-63. What do? Do you adopt the bill as is? Do you tinker with the bill, but ultimately adopt something that is, that looks like C-63? Do you start from scratch, or do you say, it's just a question of using existing legislation? There's enough tools in the toolbox to combat this hate online, and we should push for proper enforcement of existing legislation. Emily and then Michael.
I would say that the Online Harms Act proper, that's regulating social media, I think that could be passed now with just minor tinkering with it. I think there's a few things I would change about it. The criminal code provisions, major concerns, major revisions, scrap it, or I think they need to make significant changes to that. The Canadian Human Rights Act, I'm now struggling with that. I think if you even asked me a few days ago, I'd say no. Pass that one as is. They've made important advances, but that weaponization issue really is weighing on me at the moment.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I think I hinted at least my starting point here, which I would separate out the bill. And so I would put the Criminal Code and Human Rights Act provisions perhaps in their own separate bills and have a solid, robust debates around both of these issues, which would place the online harms piece, if not on a fast track, because I do think that there are still some areas where there is need of reform and there is need for study and potentially identifying issues that are not addressed in the legislation that perhaps could improve the legislation itself. So I certainly wouldn't toss it aside. I would seek to separate it, so to speak, not a Solomon-esque separation, but rather moving ahead directly with the elements on the online harms piece. The one other piece, though, that I would say is that I do not think that government gets to hold up a mission accomplished sign by saying, hey, we introduced this. It even doesn't get to put up a mission accomplished sign, even if it passes this. There is a need for leadership right now when we deal with some of these issues, and that means using the tools we have right now, both in showing leadership, in speaking out against anti-Semitism and hate, both online and offline, enforcing the laws we have right now. So government certainly needs to pay attention to this and prioritize this from a political perspective, but there is so much more that needs to be happening right now. And I think we've really suffered, at least in part, because governments at multiple levels haven't stepped up in the way that they must when it comes to this issue.
So thank you very much, both of you. Before I let my chair finish do the closing remarks, I want to personally thank you. I wanted to say to the people, I tried to go through all the questions that were in the chat. That was impossible. If you have further questions, please send them to me at info@cja.ca. I'll try to answer them as much as we can, or maybe Emily and Michael, we can still draw on your expertise a bit for those. It has been certainly for me a very enlightening experience. Well, thank you very much. And on this, Gail, the last word is yours. Gail.
Well, that was really a fascinating presentation, and I want to thank you, Richard, again for wonderfully moderating the panel, and a really big thanks to Dr. Geist and Dr. Laidlaw and Michael, particularly your closing remarks, which I think resonated so strongly with so many of us on this call, because it gets to the crux of the issue and our concerns. So thank you very much for summarizing them in that way. That was really beautiful. And a huge thank you to all of you who took the time to participate on this call and to learn a little bit more about the different aspects of the legislation. I know that I personally am taking away a better understanding of the purpose and the intent of this bill. I think I'm going to go with dividing it into two. I think that made good sense. Thank you. And I hope that the level of engagement and our community has shown on this issue continues as we move forward. We've all seen the impact of what happens online and the importance of confronting it in that space before it spills over into the real world, which is the real big concern here. And as with any piece of legislation, nothing starts out perfect. And I know that our professional team at CJA will continue to work hard to ensure that our collective concerns are heard. So thank you again, all of you, for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and a happy Pesach from all of us at CJA. Chag Sameach.